Are you good? Great. Good morning, everybody. So today we are looking at Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. And I'm going to read this. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side. While he dismissed the crowd, after he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," Jesus said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on the water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and he began to sink and cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And then when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So the first thing I want to focus on is Jesus being alone, which is verse 22. And there's no record here of Jesus providing the disciples with the information about how he would catch up to them later after he traveled alone. Though it is possible that Jesus would walk around the lake, more likely the disciples thought that he expected him to catch a ride on a different boat. He also dismissed the crowd in order to be alone. And in the next verse 23, though after he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. It is a remarkable part of the story that Jesus, who embodies and exercises the almighty power of God, nevertheless, he prays earnestly and at length to God the Father. This is critical to our understanding of Jesus. He was the divine Son to whom all authority had been given, which you find in Matthew 28, verse 18. He does mighty deeds that demonstrate a power that can belong to only God. Yet Jesus entered the world in submission to the Father. The Father's will must prevail. Jesus is the perfect model for humanity's desired submission to and reliance on God. If Jesus, the Almighty Son of God, willingly submitted to God the Father, then how much more should we, lacking in Jesus' power and authority, do the same? And then the second part of that verse, of verse 23, later that night, he was there alone. The fact that Jesus was alone indicates that he was successful in persuading everyone to depart, most by foot homeward, and the 12 in the boat. Night came as Jesus was left by himself, and any trouble on the boat would be compounded by the darkness now settling over the Sea of Galilee. And verse 24, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. The boat was far from land, near the middle of the lake. The disciples were already worn out. Their progress was hindered by the wind that pushed against them and that made their sails useless. As the wind picked up, the waves grew higher, threatening to capsize the boat. The disciples had been in similar danger before on the Sea of Galilee, but Jesus was with them in the ship. Now they were alone, or at least they thought so. So I want to take a second here, and I don't know if y'all have ever been on a boat when a storm has come up. I don't have great memories of being a kid and we were on a boat And not only did we run out of gas in the middle of the lake, it started storming, and I was terrified. I just knew we were all going to die right then and there. So I can only imagine, and I can only imagine in this time that, how their boat would be affected, because we were in a great big boat, like a big pontoon boat. But I don't know that, and we had all modern conveniences. They didn't. They had a boat with a sail. They had no motor. They had nothing. And I can only imagine how scared they were. So, and so moving on to verse 25 through 27. Verse 25, shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. So shortly before dawn was approximately 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So not only were they tired and worn out from all the energy they were experiencing on the boat and trying to keep the boat afloat, but now they're tired, and and it's dark outside, and they've come up to look out and see someone coming across the water. That would totally freak me out. I don't know about you all, but it would totally freak me out. So as this time arrived, the disciples had struggled for hours against the waves, and they were exhausted and uncertain of their position on the lake. While they may have hoped for some act of deliverance, we can speculate that at this point their hopes were fading, if not gone altogether. In this desperate situation, they saw Jesus doing the seemingly impossible, walking on water. In the Exodus, God parted the waters of the Red Sea to allow his people to walk on dry land to escape their enemies. But here is an action without compare. At the point of the disciples' greatest exhaustion and hopelessness, the Lord came to reassure and rescue. How hard it must have been for them to understand what they were seeing and believe it with their own eyes. Verse 26, when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and they cried out in fear. Added to the disciples' exhaustion and fear was the sight of what they believed to be a disembodied spirit. Surely a flesh and blood human could not be walking on water. Never mind the high waves in a storm in the middle of the night. Such a thing had never been done before. So there was no reason to interpret the sight as a physical, natural person. First the storm, now the apparition. Little wonder they cried out for fear. They felt assaulted from both the physical and the spiritual realm. Verse 27, but Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, don't be afraid. Jesus did not delay in revealing to the disciples the wholly unexpected truth that they were seeing not a disembodied spirit, but their Lord. Therefore, they could take courage in the midst of the storm. There was no more reason to be fearful of the storm that continued, and certainly no reason to fear the one who was walking on the water to join them. The two commands, take courage and don't be afraid, are two sides of the same coin. The first is a positive command on how to respond. The other is a negative command on how not to respond. God was doing extraordinary, unprecedented things that caused, that caused even the most faithful to fear. But those extraordinary things were intended as blessings, not threats. And moving on to verses 28 through 31. Verse 28, Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. The story now shifts to one disciple's reaction to Jesus' self-revelation. Peter, with what will come to be characteristic boldness, spoke up. If it's you does not express doubt. We might think of it as meaning because it is you. We might wonder why Peter asked for what he does. This bold request was not about thrill seeking. Rather, Peter wanted to share what his master was doing. Already, Jesus had sent the disciples out to preach with authority to heal and cast out demons. They were sharing in his ministry and they desired to reign with him. So Peter sought to walk with Jesus on the water by Jesus' power, following him as a disciple would. Peter's request was the product of an ambition, but it was a sacred ambition to stand with the Lord in the Lord's work. In verse 29, "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. Jesus granted Peter's request. He also granted the power to carry it out. So Peter stepped out of the boat and indeed walked on the water towards Jesus. He started out faithfully. So far, so good. But then in verse 30, when he sees the wind, he was afraid and he began to sink the Lord, and he cried out to the Lord, "Save me." That same strong wind that had buffeted the boat all night continued. As Peter made his way on the water, his situation seemed even more perilous than it was in the boat. The fear that he felt before the Lord's appearance rose again, and as it did, he could no longer walk on the water. Peter's doubt in the midst of the storm reveals that his confidence in Jesus could be shaken. Doubt is a powerful, persuasive disposition, especially when faith is challenged in times of trouble. Some would call what Peter was experiencing a failure of faith, but it was not a failure of faith to call out to Jesus to save him. Just as the disciples had called out, "Save us," when they had been in the storm before, Peter did so again. This desperate cry, stripped of all self-reliance and pride, can be the essence of faith in Jesus, especially when that faith is troubled by doubt. To experience doubt or fear is not to have lost faith. When we call out to the Lord for help, we act in faith, confessing our weakness and relying on the Lord's strength. Jesus pronounced blessing on those who were poor in spirit, meek and mourning, and hungry for righteousness, on those who have a great need and who would recognize their need. When we experience fear and doubt, if our impulse is to pray, our faith is not failing, but acting. In verse 31, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" As Jesus did on other occasions, he made physical contact with the one whom he delivered. When we're guilty of inadequate faith, we can remember what Jesus did in the passage before us. Yes, Peter's faith was weak. Under stress, he was plagued by doubt. But Jesus rescued Peter anyway. Peter's faith was still sufficient to call out to Jesus for help. Our relationship with Jesus depends on how ready we are to recognize our weaknesses and rely on his strength. That extends to trusting that his strength, he can overcome our doubts and worries. And then moving on to verse 32, when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. So when Jesus and Peter climbed into the boat, that's when Jesus made the winds die down. He didn't do it beforehand. He waited until they were in the boat. We note that Jesus did not rescue Peter by calming the storm, as in Matthew 8:26. Rather, Jesus rescued Peter while the storm was still raging. The storm disappeared only after they climbed into the boat. Jesus does not always calm the storms of life, but he is always there to rescue or calm us in one way or another. Surely, like Peter and the other disciples in the boat, we have enough reason to trust Jesus. What God has revealed to us about the Son is true and trustworthy, ample reason for confidence. Verse 33. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." The disciples had just witnessed Jesus demonstrate power only available to God. They saw him empower one of their one of their number to join him as his sovereign control of the deep. As they were reunited with their master, they worshiped him, acknowledging his authority and expressing their submission and dependence. They could conclude that nothing less than Jesus was utterly unlike any other. For the Jewish people of Jesus' time, the phrase Son of God first meant Jesus was God's promised king, the great son of David. Certainly the disciples were affirming at least that much here. Jesus showed his kingly authority in what he had just done. After Jesus' resurrection, Jesus's followers called him Son of God with an enhanced understanding. With this phrase, they affirmed him to be both God's king and God himself. And the conclusion, calling out for help. Peter sometimes said and did impressive things. Today's text shows Peter doing something remarkable during a crisis of faith. When he began to doubt, he almost snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. Peter had a problem with consistency. But Peter is not the most important character in the story. Jesus is. Jesus' power was greater than Peter's doubt, just as it is greater than our doubts. Trusting the Lord, whom we do not see, is hard to maintain when the negative things that we do see test our faith. The resulting doubt is the proof that our faith is being tested. Is doubt then a symptom of inconsistent faith? It can be if it's never resolved, if it leads us to abandon our hope and trust in Christ. But if doubt prompts us to call out to the Lord for help, then doubt is a seeking faith, faith that seeks understanding, faith that seeks divine word of peace in the middle of fear. When you experience doubt, did you call out to the Lord? Perhaps you're crying out for help right now. You can know that the Lord hears you and that the certainty of his faithfulness is more important than the size of your faith. Or maybe your boat is sailing smoothly right now and you barely think about the Lord not being in the boat with you. Realize that a time will come when the winds will blow against you all night. And though it may seem that you are alone in the waves, the Lord knows your distress and will come to you if you bid him to do so. Remember, he is with you right now as well. He is always with his people to the end of the age. So did anybody have any questions or thoughts about today's text?
Thank you, Cheryl. We'll go ahead and end the recording and then we can talk after that.